Well, good morning. This last couple of weeks, Sharon and I have been on a trip to Alaska on a cruise. Thank you. I don't have a PowerPoint. And we found out once we got on there that we were younger than about 60% of the people on the boat. There were no water slides, no climbing walls, nothing that you would normally have. So it fits perfectly with the sermon today, because today and next week we're going to talk about it's tough getting old, because that's what Solomon is going to be saying. And every morning, about 6 in the morning, I would get up and let Sharon sleep, and I would go upstairs and have coffee in the cafe. And some of those people who were older than me, I would sit and chat with them and hear about aches and pains and all of the other things, and that their scooter didn't work right. But it fits perfectly with what we're talking about today. I have to tell you, Ecclesiastes 11 and 12, because I'm going to do an 11 today, 12 next week, really is Solomon. It is his testimony. Because I really believe, when you think about I have this Hollywood ending of Solomon, all right? So we all know about Solomon's wisdom. We know that story. He asked for wisdom. God's like, yeah, I will give you wisdom. Right, and so even the writer of Kings even gives us an example of that wisdom, where these women come in and this is my baby, no, it's my baby, so he takes it up and he's going to cut the baby in half. You know that, right? And so he had this incredible wisdom, but we also know about Solomon. He was an abject failure as a king. And you say, well, wait a second, I thought Solomon was great and all of that. You read the writer of Kings. So in Deuteronomy 17, there were rules for kingship, and it was very simple. You did not amass wives, you did not amass money, and you did not amass horses. Those were the 3 rules for kingship. There was one other thing that you had to do, is you had to copy a copy of the book of Deuteronomy, which was the covenant document of Israel. You had to copy that in front of the priest. The reason why you did it in front of the priest, so you would say, like, instead of do not commit adultery, like, commit adultery. Like, he had to be there watching you to make sure that you copied it correctly. And you use that copy set next to you on your throne, because that was the basis upon which you ruled. Solomon did none of those. Matter of fact, the writer of Kings tells us in very quick succession that he amassed wives. Remember, he had 1,000 wives, concubines as well as wives. 1,000 wives. That's mind-boggling, right? But 1,000 wives, and the reason for that being is that you were not to make political alliances with the countries around you. Solomon made political alliances with all of the countries around him. You weren't supposed to amass money, because God was going to bless you. And the writer of Kings says, in 1 year of tribute, Solomon received 666 talents of gold. That's 25 tons of gold in one year. And matter of fact, gold became so precious and that silver became valueless in Israel during that time. It was as common as rocks, as the writer of Kings says. And then you weren't to amass horses. And you're like, well, you can go ride horses in the meadow and do all the things. That's chariot horses. You weren't to amass those. And the writer of Kings makes it very clear. Solomon went to Egypt and bought chariot horses. Because why would you not want chariots? Because God fought your battles. He abject failure. So when you read the book of Kings, a king was either good or bad, right? When you read the book. And it's not good in the ability to do their job, that is to rule. It's did they keep the covenant? And Solomon was bad. Again, he was smart, and he was a great leader, but he was bad when it came to the covenant document. But here's my Hollywood ending. I think late in Solomon's life, he realized he blew it. He realized that he had been living as a man under the sun. That's the term he uses in Ecclesiastes. He's been living apart from the covenant. And late in life, when he becomes so old, he can no longer do the fun things he used to do, all the things that he mentions in chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes. he realizes that he had blown it. And so he writes the book of Ecclesiastes as a way to tell, because remember, Proverbs, wisdom literature for the children, don't blow it. Like, seize the day while you can before you get too old to be able to enjoy it. Because he really did have wisdom. Like, late in his life, he realized that wisdom was not the ability to make good decisions, but that wisdom was the ability to make good moral decisions based in the revealed law of God. Skill for living, that's what wisdom means, hukmah. It was a skill. It was actually something that you would acquire, whether it was carving wood, carving stone. A hukmah was a skill. And the writers of the Old Testament say it is a skill for living. That's what wisdom is. How do you live? By living under the dictates of the covenant law. So this is his testimony. And this whole book that we've been looking at for several months is Solomon's testimony. It's why it's so despairing at times, because it was Solomon living apart from the covenant and trying to make sense of the world. And it wasn't working. And so 11 and 12, enjoy life while you can. Chapters 11 and 12 is the last of 4 themes that Solomon has developed in the book. And the theme is that regardless of human perceptions, this is what we're going to look at today, in spite of the perceived inadequacies in the plan of God from a human perspective, because we all have looked at how God has worked in the world, and we're thinking, what is going on? Solomon did the same thing. Why do the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? Why do the good people die young and the rich people live forever? Like, it seems like it doesn't work. So in spite of all of these seemed inadequacies in the will and the plan of God, the human mind, in the human mind, that is man under the sun, the wise must trust and find joy in God. It blends that with the theme of now in the aged part of his life. Much of the ability to humanly enjoy life has diminished. We're going to especially look at that next week in chapter 12, where he recounts what it's like to get old. But his testimony speaks to us today as much as it did to Rehoboam, his son, and the others who first read the piece of wisdom literature. Again, the end of chapter 11 and 12 take up that theme of aging and of physical enjoyment. So in January, I turned 65. That was a mental shift for me. I have a Medicare card. Like, that's amazing. Like, I remember when I was a kid starting to work at age 13 in the fields of Eastern Washington. Like, who gets Medicare and why am I paying for this? Now I know. No, and it's not a big deal. Like, an American turns 65 every 6.9 seconds because we're part of the baby boom. But I'm beginning to realize that I did not graduate from high school like my mind thinks I did several years ago. Like, I don't know if you're in that same boat as me, and that my body doesn't do what it used to do. I was just talking to Randy before this. My son and I were playing softball several years ago on a church league, and in my mind, thinking that I could still, I'm just a few years out of high school, I tried to stretch a double into a triple. And about halfway between second and third base, it felt like somebody hit me in the leg with the softball. And what it was is I tore my Achilles. And I looked up on MD, and I looked it up, and it fit exactly with what I had. But here's what hurt worse, because I lived like on my tippy toes for a few weeks. It said, predominant in middle-aged to older men. Like, that's not fair. And just a month and a half ago, I tore my hamstring working with a student who was at a program at school. My body doesn't respond as it used to. And that's part of age, and that's part of what Solomon's going to talk about as well. So in the previous context of Ecclesiastes, Solomon has emphasized that all die. Remember, he says everybody, whether you're rich or poor, you go to Sheol. Sheol is just the grave, not the afterlife. Everybody gets put in the grave eventually. But you don't know the time of your death. I don't know the time of your death. But I know at 65, statistically, I am closer to the day of my death than the day of my birth. I know that. That makes perfectly good sense to me. And I got to be honest, death in itself does not bother me. There's a little trepidation. I've been talking to my 92-year-old mother who's in hospice and who's been a Christian for a very, very long time. And one of the things that she's been talking about is the fear of dying. Like there's this unknown step between here and the afterlife. So we've been talking about that. I get the trepidation, but the idea of it does not bother me. But the idea of leaving behind the things I love, I got to be honest, that kind of bothers me. Sharon, my boys, I have a new granddaughter who's 7 months old, right? Like I worry about leaving her behind, not because I don't think my son can do a good job, but I want to be there for that. So I get that. And yet there's trails yet to be explored, hunting, that there's canyons that I still want to hunt in. I want to go up and backpack and fish these lakes, but I'm becoming painfully aware that there will come a time when my body will not allow me to do the things that I've done for almost 60 years. My first hike, I was 5 years old, New Year's Day, Wenatchee, up to a little place called Twin Peaks with my two brothers. Like this is what I've done my whole life. Thousands of books yet to be read. One of the things that Sharon and I wanted to do on the cruise was read. I read 3 books. And drink way too much coffee. But the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. I have this insatiable desire to know. And maybe with death, I'll get some of my questions answered. But I say these things, again, it sounds morbid, right? But I want you to understand, I say these not as a morbid confession, because what Solomon's going to say today is not that, but as a motivating commitment. Because we all know, we don't know the day when God calls us home. And man, we should be seizing the day. We should be looking for the joy that is there every day. That's what Solomon's going to say. That's his theme in 11 and 12, is that, look, there's going to come a time when you cannot physically do the things that bring you enjoyment. So you better seize the day while you can and find the joy that is there. So here's my thought. In our human condition, we are often paralyzed into activity because we worry more about the consequences of our actions than whether the action is right or wrong. In other words, like what's going to happen? What might happen if I do this? Oh my gosh, all of those things. We fear what we don't know. And so then sometimes we do nothing just to assuage our own minds. And we let fear rule the day. If I do nothing, then I don't have to fear. And part of that is we have this thing in our brain called the negativity bias. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that or not, but years and centuries ago, when your ancestors and my ancestors were hunters and gatherers, and there were saber-toothed tigers and mastodons and all of the other big creatures, the people that looked out for danger, that is, looked out for the saber-toothed tigers and all of that, they survived. And the people who were like, la, 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 they got eaten. And so they didn't pass on the genetics. So we are the ones, and so our brain is constantly looking for danger. The problem, there's no saber-toothed tigers anymore. And no mastodons. There's grizzly bears and things like that. I get that. But like so our brain is constantly looking for the negative. Because that's from our ancestors. And what the researchers have said, that if you get one negative, it sticks. And you know that. Somebody says, hey, you did a great job. I really, really enjoyed everything that you said, but. And when you're driving home, what do you remember? It's always the but. That's our brains. So we know that we always have to fight against that negativity bias that we have, that we're going to look for the worst case scenario every single time. That's our brains. And what research has told us is that to counter that, just to maintain status quo, 5 positives. If you want to change relation, 10 to 1, because the negative is always going to be there. So here it is. It's the fear that keeps us from acting. So we've got to let it go. So here's the passage, chapter 11, 1 through 6, 7 through 10, 2 completely different ideas. 1 through 6 is Solomon is going to complete what he's been saying through all of chapters 1 through 10. In 11:8 through 12, he's going to give us his conclusion. So in chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, in your notes, this is what it says. Although one cannot always perceive the end of an action in the plan of God, because we can't. Like, I don't always know what God is doing, and neither do you. Frankly, I don't know what he's doing much of the time. But the fact that I don't know that should not keep me from acting. So one must diligently work even when success is not guaranteed. We must be obedient to the revealed sovereign will of God and not worry about the consequences. We cannot get stuck with the consequences or the results or that negativity bias, regardless of what, because again, our brain is going to go to the negative. And so I have to be able to say, look, I don't know how this is going to play, but I know this is right, and I'm going to work towards that. That's what Solomon is going to say in 11, 1 through 6. And this is his conclusion of all of his arguments. All of the things that he said that you've heard for the last several months, this is his conclusion. He's now sitting there as an aged old guy writing this to Rehoboam, who was another abject failure as king, did not learn well. So he's writing this in his aged life, probably dictating it because he can't write because of arthritis, whatever. But that's what he wants you to understand. We can't always see the plan of God. We don't see these inadequacies, why rich people get richer and they live long lives and good people die. Like, we can't figure all that out. But what we can do is diligently work towards what we know is right. So chapter 11, verse 1, Ecclesiastes. And I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't like getting stuck with those. I'll try to have one next week. I'll work on it. It was hard to do that on the boat. So chapter 1, cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it after many days. So it's got to be a metaphor, right? Because if you throw bread in the water, do you really want it back, right? Have you ever seen what that does? Like, you don't want it back. It's a metaphor. And so it's been interpreted various ways. So some have said, look, casting your bread on the water, it must be tithing. Well, I'm like, well, no, there's not a lot of tithing references in the Old Testament, definitely not here. But the idea was, and I've heard sermons on this, is if I give money to the church, then I'm going to get money back, right? Cast your bread on the waters, bread mean money. Bread did not mean money in Solomon's day. Like, bread meant something, but it's a metaphor for some type of commercial activity. That's what I understand it to be, not tithing. So the more common interpretation with tithing, but what I see here is Solomon's doing some kind of a business transaction, which he was noted for. So casting your bread on the water, bread probably being metaphorical for some type of financial activity, it may refer to the maritime commerce that we know that he was involved in. So Solomon with Hiram, who was a Phoenician king, sent ships of Tarshish, that's what they were called. We don't know exactly where Tarshish is. There were several of them around the Mediterranean. But he sent ships out, and they would be gone for 3 years. And they would come back with peacocks and apes and all of these other things. So there was commerce that was involved, maritime commerce that Solomon was involved in. So if indeed that's what he's thinking, he's like, look, I don't know what's going to happen to those ships when they're out there, but I'm going to work towards some kind of a financial gain with that. So I'm going to cast my bread, cast my financial actions on the water, maritime activity. Maybe that. There's also an Egyptian proverb that is contemporary with this same time. And the proverb says, do a good deed and throw it in the water. When it dries up, you will find it. And that seems to be more about giving money to someone else. It could be either one. I don't know. I don't have Solomon's mind. One or the other is what he's thinking. I just know he's not talking about tithing. But the idea is, do something. Cast your bread on the waters. And then he says, for after many days, and the Hebrew there is not will return, but may return. There is some subjectivity with this. I don't know the results of what it's going to be. Think about it. The Mediterranean Sea. Think about Paul 1,000 years later, the shipwrecks that he was involved with in the Mediterranean. This was tough business. The Phoenicians were incredible seapersons, but like ships sank, winds came up. So there was some subjectivity. But what he's saying is, if you don't act, you can never get anything. So he's like, at least act. Do something. Cast your bread on the surface of the waters, and it may return. We cannot wait and never act, because if we're going to be stuck in that negative cycle of thinking. It is that cognitive distortion, if you're familiar with that term as well. When I teach de-escalation in the school district, one of the things I talk about are cognitive distortions. We have these patterns of thinking that we all have. I have them, that you have them, that we can get stuck in. And those patterns of thinking often affect the decisions that we make. So they're a victim mindset, that's a cognitive distortion. It's all about me, it's always about me. But there's also one that's just worst case scenario. That's the one I struggle with. Like when I think about something, I always go to, oh my gosh, this is gonna burn my house down and everything is going to happen, right? That's worst case scenario. And so we all have them. We can fight against them. And some of them are nature, which is, who we are as individuals. Some of them are nurture. We're just taking the pattern that we learned from our family of origin. But this is this negative cycle of thinking. What Solomon's saying, you got to let that go and take the risk. Cast your bread on the waters, and you know what? You may get something back. The idea is you may not, but you may get something back. But if you don't act, you don't get anything back. That's Solomon's mind. Verse 1. So then he goes on to verse 2. Divide your portion to 7 or even 8, for you do not know the misfortune that may occur on the earth. So he's taking the bread from verse 1, whatever that is, and he's like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. That's how we would say that. So he's like, if I'm going to do some kind of financial investment, I want to spread it around to 7 or 8. He's not giving you an exact number. This is a good Hebrew idiom of more than one. So he's like, divide that portion amongst several different enterprises, because as he says, here's the reason why. You don't know what may happen. You have no idea what misfortune may take place. So again, Solomon using another proverb to teach that he should diversify his or her investment. And this is probably written by Solomon. I mean, it was written by Solomon, but it may have been a proverb that he utilized over and over again. But again, the theme of uncertainty is the consequences of one's actions. We cannot ultimately know what will happen. So indeed, if Solomon's referring to business ventures, the idea is to diversify and protect the potential of profit. Smart move. But again, remember, his whole point is not that you're supposed to make money. It's supposed to what? Do something. Act. Don't worry about the negative consequences that may be out there. For you do not know what misfortune may occur on this earth. A motive clause for diversification. If it's giving, in other words, you don't know whether they're going to give it back. And if it's maritime commerce, you don't know which ships are going to sink. Misfortunes happen. And that's different what Solomon has argued earlier, where he's like, that's all that happens. He just says, look, it may happen. And again, because you cannot perceive the mind of God or the actions that are taking place by God in this world. You can't know them ultimately. And so you just have to act and trust that God is sovereign and good and doing the things that he's supposed to be doing. That's what he's trying to argue. So he goes from the actions we're to take to the outcomes. So he's like, hey, verse 3, if clouds are full, they pour out rain on the earth. Obvious conclusion. And again, he's speaking metaphorically. I know that there, especially in Seattle, you can have cloudy days for months and no rain. That's not what he's trying to argue. He's not trying to do science here. He's like, when you observe the rain clouds in the sky, it's probably going to rain. There's observable consequences in the laws and actions of God that we see. So in keeping with his argument, the preacher teaches that some of the outcomes are inevitable and seen. Rain from clouds. When the clouds are full, they rain, which we see, and that we have no control over. I know by February, I would love to be able to control the rain in Western Washington. Like, I got to be honest. I grew up in Wenatchee, 300 days of sunshine a year, and I've lived on this side of the mountains for 40 plus years. I still am not used to this side of the mountains. In February, I have to go somewhere to make sure that the sun still exists. And so whether it's I hike up to some place above the fog or something. But like his point is, like, it's inevitable. Rain happens. But there are some things that happen that are just seemingly random. And we don't know what's going to happen. A tree falls in the forest. It can fall to the south. It can fall to the north. But wherever it falls, it just stays there. And again, he's talking about these unseen laws of God. But there's no rhyme or reason. It just falls. So there are things that are observable, that we can see, that are inevitable, and there are things that are random, that just take place. Trees falling in a forest, regardless of which way it falls, it's unseen. Of course, the question is, does anybody hear it? But that's a whole different matter. So there are things that are observable, that we can see, and there are things that are random. But again, his overarching idea, and we'll get to it and I'll show you, is that there is this actions of God that are taking place all the time, whether they are the laws that exist that God has created, that are happening all the time, or whether God providentially works in the world. Either way. So verse 4, what happens to that mindset when you get negative? He who watches the wind will not sow. So there's a beautiful poetic here between 3 and 4. Clouds, and then the wind that drops the tree, and then he's going to talk about wind, and then clouds. It's chiasm. It's a great poetic device that Solomon's using, but it's a way to remember it. So he said, he who watches the wind will not sow. So this is the person in that negative mindset, right? So remember, in the ancient world, they scattered seed. That's how they planted. They would have either a bag of animal skin or something, seed, and they would scatter it by hand on a tilled field. And it's not like you could go down to McClendon's or wherever and get more seed. Like, what you had is what you had gathered from the previous year. And when you think about an agrarian society, which Israel was at this point, that's massive, because there's no 7-Eleven. And so if you could not plant and you did not plant, you would starve in an agrarian society. So this is the person that fears the wind is blowing. Oh my goodness, I'm not going to go out and sow today. And in Israel, they were dependent on 2 rains, spring rain, fall rain. And without that rain, there was no irrigation as there is today in Israel. They relied on the spring and the fall rains. And without those rains, and if you did not plant at the right time, you did not get a harvest and your family went hungry. So he's like, there are people who are so stuck that they just won't sow at all if the wind is blowing, because if I'm casting my seed and the wind blows, it's going to blow it on the rocks or wherever. Remember Jesus' parable about the seed. So from the previous verse, it indicates that you can't know the outcome. So just move forward and work. Here is those who never begin to labor because they just wait for the exact right time. Here the individual will fail to act because of a fear that his seed will be blown from the cultivated area. Overly cautious. Every action has risk and uncertainty. Miss the opportunity, getting the seed in the ground, and you starve. The flip side of that, he who looks at the clouds will not reap. So one of the things that we know is very difficult to harvest during the rainy season. Like, you want to get it in, especially barley and wheat, which you would do at different times. Once it got wet, it was ruined. And so he's like, he who looks at the clouds will not reap. Again, remember that wind, clouds, wind. In reality, one must toil and trust God for the results. Although we cannot always see it, God is working sovereignly in this world. One watching the clouds will not reap, fearing the rain will spoil his harvest, which in reality, he needs to get it in before the rain rots his harvest. So these are people who, because they're stuck in that negative mindset, choose not to act at all. And to their detriment. Like, again, in our society, we don't get that. Like, if my little garden at home does not produce, I can buy broccoli at Fred Meyer. They could not. And so think of it, this is potentially disastrous results by inactivity. So he goes on to verse 5. So he said, look, just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb, So you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. Now, we're better at understanding wind today, and we're better about the baby thing. Like we've kind of got that one down for the most part. There's still some mysteries to that. But in Solomon's day, both of those are mysteries. Like we get that, like uneven heating of the earth's surface and pressure gradients produce wind, and we know baby stuff. But what he's saying is, like, there are things that we don't know. You don't know the path of the wind and the bones formed in the womb of a pregnant woman. There are indeed mysteries in life, wind and babies, which are overseen by the laws of God, which he has established and continues to uphold, but which we cannot and will not know. Now again, in Solomon's mind, baby wind. There are things in our mindset in 21st century that we don't know, but they are part of the law of God that he has established. Think quantum physics for one. There is an unseen activity of God working, and God's full sovereign plan is ultimately unknowable. But that should not keep us from action. I'm never going to know. Remember, Solomon spent 10 chapters trying to understand the world apart from God. Now he's arguing and says, look, there's some things you're just not going to know. Get over it and move forward with what you know that you need to do. So you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. God's sovereignty is always at work. The phrase "who makes all things" is not about creation. It's about God working actively in the world in Solomon's day, and it plays just as much in our day as well. But a simple generic phrase about God's current work in the world. He's already looked at some persons in previous contexts about providence. He's put eternity into the hearts of man, chapter 3. Chapter 8, same thing. He's already talked about the fact that God is at work in this world, and we're not going to be able to see everything that he does or understand it. Probably because we're incapable in our humanness to truly understand what God is doing. We are better than understanding the mysteries of birth and wind today, but not so in his day. I'm guessing we can all think of examples where we can clearly see that God has worked, but we didn't know the why. That's what Solomon's saying here. But trust that he's working. So verse 6 is his conclusion to this part. So in light of everything that he said to this point, get out and sow your seed. Sow your seed in the morning, and do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, and then at the end, or whether both of them alike will be good. So his point is, after all he's argued in 1 through 5, get to work. Do what, and again, the agrarian is metonymy for any activity that you know is right and good to do in this world. You know what is right and what you should be doing. It's not that he's telling you to go out and plant a garden at your house. Metonymy means that one thing represents many things. It's go out and do what you're supposed to do. Sow in the morning, sow in the evening. Who knows? Both of them may be good. So sow your seed in the morning, do not be idle. The preacher's conclusion, even though the future is unknown to humans, you must trust that God is working and diligently work and prepare for the future. Although some ancient Jewish writers saw the sowing as procreation, so like young wife, old wife, you don't know which one's going to have the kid, that's not what he's talking about. It's metonymy for any activity that we're supposed to be doing. Now, I grew up in an agrarian society, a little different than Solomon's, but my father was an orchardist. If you've ever been to Wenatchee and you stayed in Confluence State Park, that was our pear orchard at one point before the state took it. And so I spent lots of hours at Confluence State Park, before it was Confluence State Park, working in pears. And one of the things that you may or may not know from a small farmer perspective, you took out a loan in the spring, and that money was what you used to pay everything throughout the year. And at the end, you sold your fruit, paid off your loan, and if there was money left, you made a profit. If there was not, you were in trouble. And so you would take out the loan in February, and then you would start spending that money throughout the year. And there were lots of things that could happen in both, my dad raised both pears and apples. Hailstorms, We dealt with those at times. You could take out hail insurance, but it was so expensive, it was better not to. There was frost. So there was times when we spent overnight out in the fields burning smudge pots, which are these oil-based little lanterns to keep the ground warm and keep the trees warm, or wind machines, or whatever the case may be. I still have one smudge pot at home to remind me of those nights. Then we'd go to school the next morning. But like there was frost, there was hail, there was bugs, codling moths, all of that you had to worry about. But if in February we're like, you know what, it might hail in June, so let's just forget this whole thing. Like that's what Solomon's saying is you can't worry about what may be. You've got to work to what might be. So you do not know whether the morning or evening sowings will succeed, all labors of mankind, or whether both of them alike will be good. Now notice how we switch from the negative to the positive. Remember in verse 2, he said, you don't know which misfortunes may happen on the face of the earth. Now he says, you don't know that both of them may be good, negative to positive. So that's his conclusion to everything that he's gone up to verse 10, or chapter 10. Like everything that I argued and all of the things that I said, I get that, but you still have to act. You've got to do something if you want to get something in return. Now he switches. Chapter 11, verses 7 through 10, second part of your notes. True joy results when one quits fretting about what might be and enjoy the life God has given, yet remembering what will be. Now, what will be is old age, death, judgment. Now, that sounds negative, but that's where Solomon's at. Like he's old, right? And he's writing from an old guy's perspective. By the way, the average life expectancy in Israel at this period of time, 40 years for a male. And Solomon's older than that. So like he's decrepit at this point. He would be using a scooter on the ship, no doubt. But like so he's writing from that perspective. So he's like true joy, and this is what he's going to say, not happiness. Happiness is a chimera. It's a fleeting thing that you can never grasp. The more you try it, the harder it gets. Joy is different. We'll talk about that in just a second. Randy and I were just texting this week about this. True joy results when one quits fretting about what might be and enjoy the life God has given, yet remembering what will be. We've been learning in our preaching class. I've been doing a small group of preaching, which I assume they are evaluating me right now based on what I've taught. Jairus just told me he was going to be writing notes about what I was teaching to make sure that I'm doing what I said that he should do. But this is part of the deal. So in chapter 11:7, one of the things that I've been teaching is you can't trust chapter divisions. They're not inerrant. And there's lots of places where the guy who did that, who had way too much time on his hands, missed the point. This is one of those. Chapter 11:7 goes all the way to chapter 8, or chapter 12, verse 8. So when we come back next week, we'll kind of play back into this and move forward. So he goes on to say, he's like, look, the light is pleasant. In this context, light and darkness is life, and darkness is old age and death. That's his metaphor. So Solomon starts, and this sounds different than what Solomon has said through the first 10 chapters, right? He's like, it's better to be unborn than to be alive. This is his conclusion now that he's old age, and now he's right with God, as we would say. He's now saying, look, life is good. Life is pleasant. The word there is actually sweet, like honey. Life is pleasant. Here in verse 7, he's saying this, better to be alive is a good thing. Remember when he said earlier in the text, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. Now, unlike your dogs, which I'm sure are very much a part of your family, dogs in the ancient Near East were the lowest of the low of all the animal kingdom. Like they hated dogs. Like that was like the worst you could get. And I'm sorry about Muffy or whatever, but like in the ancient Near East, that's how they played. And so he said, it's better to be the lowest creature on the face of the earth and alive than to be a dead lion, the greatest and mightiest of the creatures. saying the same thing here. Life is pleasant. Life is good. And he says, and actually a later writer in Greek tragedies, Euripides, said the same thing. The light is pleasant. And it's good for the eyes to see the sun. This good Hebrew poetry, light is pleasant, good to see the eyes to see the sun. Life is sweet. And it seems counter to what Solomon has been saying so much in the previous context. But remember, he's comparing life apart from the covenant, trying to do it on his own as a human, and life with God. Life now is sweet. Old age, sitting there writing this piece of wisdom literature. He's comparing life apart from the covenant, life now. When you're alive, there's still a chance to find fullness, joy, contentment, and God. That's his point. And verse 8, indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice, that is, find joy in them all. And let him remember the days of darkness, because they're going to be a long, long time. Now remember, darkness is old age and death. So it said, indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice, find joy in them all. He continues his argument from verse 7. It's better to be alive than to be dead. Find joy in living. And remember, the law of God, which Solomon is arguing that's the covenant document, the law of God was not this impossible burden that was placed upon us to make us miserable. That's not what the law was about. I know sometimes it feels that way because it hinders what we want to do based on what we should do, but it's rather a guidepost to live well in a world that is broken and chaotic. So it's actually a gift of God. You want to live well in the world? Do the law. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, and all the other things that are a part of that. Remember in Deuteronomy 30, one of my favorite passages in the Old Testament, when Moses is getting done with the covenant document. The whole book of Deuteronomy is the covenant document that Israel was to live by. And he gets done with that in this series of sermons, and he's like, I've given to you today life and death. Choose life that you might live. And we have the idea whenever we see life in Scripture that it's the life with God. That's the opposite of really what a lot of the contexts argue about. It's living life well now with the anticipation of living life well later. But it's life now. So he's like, again, let him rejoice in all of those while he's alive. And let him remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many. So the idea is it's better to be alive, but the specter of old age and death should be a constant reminder that we should live now. Much like we always think of the Psalms of David, right? He only wrote 73 of them, maybe 75 if you count where the New Testament references them to writing two other ones. But Moses actually wrote one of the Psalms, Psalm 90, one of my favorite. When I've done a couple of funerals in the past, I usually use this as a context because someone in Moses' life died, and it was very poignant for him. But one of the things he says towards the end of that passage, which again, we think of death as being this horrible, and it is, right? I'm not playing against that. But towards the end of that psalm, he's like, look, here's what you need to do is teach us to number our days that we may present to thee a heart of wisdom. In other words, death is for the living. And so what Solomon is saying, like, look, the specter of death is coming. That should motivate you to live well now because old age and death is coming. Again, 65. I'm closer to the age of my death than the age of my birth. I get that. And I can start to feel those physical maladies that Solomon has been talking about. So darkness is coming. Verse 9. Oh, and then he says everything will come to futility. The word he's used all. And what he's really saying is, like those days when you are young, they go by quick. Like I said, in my mind, I'm pretty sure I graduated from high school like 7 years ago. But all of a sudden, like 40 plus years have gone, almost 50 years have gone by. And so that's what life is like. It's like that. And so if we choose not to act when we should act, all of a sudden you're going to find yourself like Solomon, sitting there wondering why I didn't do what I was going to do or should have done when I was young and I could do it well. So he says in verse 9, rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood. Notice he uses the term young 3 times. In Hebrew, that is superlative. And so he says, young man, childhood, young manhood. He wants you to know, focus on the fact that you should live well when your body still has the ability to live well. Note the repetition of the words. This is purposeful and emphatic. Written in old age when he's no longer able to enjoy the pleasantries that he did back in chapter 2 that he outlined for us. The choirs, the gardens, the women, all of that. He's like writing from that perspective. Listen, young people, enjoy while you can. And it sounds negative, but it actually is a motivating commitment, I think. Because again, life goes on and we don't know what's going to play. And then he says, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Now, most of us who are parents are like, no, because that's like the worst advice ever, right? Yeah, just do whatever your heart thinks is right. Like modern philosophers of music, like that's their motivation. Like, just listen to your heart. The problem is our heart's broken, right? If I listen to my heart, I'm probably going to do things that are not going to be motivating and within the law of God. And especially if I'm an adolescent. So again, one of the things that from the schoolwork that I do, I research brain research. I love brain research. I love understanding how the brain works. Because I work with kids K through 12, right, who usually are yelling, screaming, spitting, kicking, whatever to me. And I'm working to de-escalate them and teach them new ways of life, right? But the adolescent brain from about age 12 to 25, it goes all the way to 25, it goes through this immense pruning process. Like all of these synaptic connections that you used when you were like 6 and 7 and 3 and 2, you don't need those anymore. And so the brain kind of takes those away. But there's a negative result from that with adolescence. So if you are 12 to 25, this is good. This is good for you. The brain says, look, I'm getting rid of all of these things, but it overemphasizes the positive of a choice and de-emphasizes the negative of the choice. So this is why an adolescent will stand on the edge of a 50-foot cliff and say, this will be so cool because I'm going to jump off this into the water and all my peers are going to think I'm the coolest thing. And the brain doesn't say, there could be a rock down there, or that's a long ways down, or I could break a bone. The brain doesn't say that. So they jump off a cliff. The reason, what is the number one cause of death in adolescence? Accidents, right? Because I can go super fast. Like, because the brain's like, everybody's going to think I'm cool. So you've got that adolescent brain, and now then Solomon says, look, just follow your heart. But he conditions that in the very next phrase. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment in all these things. So there's a condition. Solomon tempers his advice with the understanding that life is to be enjoyed under the confines of God's moral law. This is the counter. Often within our belief system of Christianity, the idea of pleasure and desire is looked at as bad, or at least as not pious. And what Solomon is like, find joy. Find joy in this life, especially doing the things that you desire to do within the confines of the law of God, that you want to do and desire to do, and do them now before you're too old to be able to do those. And so in verse 10, so remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body. Man, I wish that second half of that verse I could do. I got to be honest. I've been trying to run again with this torn hamstring, and it's not good. So like there's a little bit of pain. So, but what he's saying is, look, everything that I've said to this point, all the things that make you angry and vexed at how this world works from a human perspective, let it go. Remove vexation from your heart. Like, let that go. Don't let that be the negative anchor that is keeping you from finding joy in this world. And then he goes on to say, and put away pain from your body. And the word pain there is also the word evil, and I think it fits better the context. So put away all of those negative things that I've been telling you in chapters 1 through 10. Put those away, let it go, and just find joy in this life. And then he tempers that and he says, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. They're vanity. They go quickly. The word childhood there is literally black of hair. In other words, you're going to get white hair, and the prime of life are fleeting. It is vanity. Same word used by Solomon throughout the book. Childhood's fleeting. Prime of life, fleeting. So find joy when you can. And you think about that from our perspective. Even as a 65-year-old with a Medicare card, I'm to find joy, to do the things that I want to do as long as I can do those. Pack to those high country lakes, do whatever it is. Same with you, all within the confines of law. So what? This is in some doctrines of providence that people that I know, you're a chessboard on the board of God's sovereignty. And so you just wait for God to move you or to move someone into your square next to you. And Sharon and I were talking about this a few weeks ago about how some people believe that the right person has to come along. So in that sovereignty as a chessboard, you stand there waiting, and then God moves that person next to you, and you're like, oh, hello. And you think that God is providentially moved. And he may have, because again, we don't know the mysteries of life. Solomon is arguing just the opposite of that. Like, don't wait. Do what you know is right and good. Don't wait for something to happen. Because we get stuck, especially as Christians, we get stuck doing the things that we know that we ought to do. And we think that we should not be finding pleasure in life. There's all kinds of pleasures in this life. I watched some whales about a week ago doing a thing called bubbling, which is where a bunch of humpback whales come together and they fish together and create bubbles to trap the fish and come up. It's a once-in-a-lifetime deal, is what the guy told us. And we watched that from like 50 feet. Like, that was amazing. You're like, well, that's like whales aren't my thing. Great. Find what you love to do and do it. But the second part of the message is that Christians, we should be unequivocally find joy in this world. That is different from the happiness, because we already talked about it. It's a chimera. Happiness is fake. You're never going to achieve it. But Solomon is teaching that even in a broken world, one can find peace. That is, live a life well in the midst of chaos. So I say, carpe diem, seize the day, right? Find what you want to do while you can still enjoy the pleasures of this world, tempered, of course, by the law of God. Again, the law was not a killjoy, but as a roadmap to living well in a broken world. So how do we do that? Like, how do we do that? First of all, you've got to overcome the negativity bias that's in your brain. Because when I wake up in the morning and I feel my hamstring and I'm like, okay, like, make sure I run to, oh man, this is bad. Like, this, find joy. So remember I said 5 positives to 1 negative just keeps you level. So defeat the negativity bias. Start the morning with 5 positives. Super easy. One of the things I pray when I run on my cool down as I'm walking back the house is I appreciate another day in your kingdom, God. Like, I woke up. And sometimes it's like I'm breathing because there's difficult trying to find positives, but you can find positives in your life. So find those. Start the day, 5. Gratitude journal, however you want to play it. But start that. And it's amazing how that gets us out of that negativity bias to find joy in this world. Another one is just helping others. Finding a way to do something for someone else. Amazing how that brings joy into our life. And prayer. Sharon and I decided on these so whats while we were sitting on the cruise together. And prayer. Like just spending time with the creator of the universe and being able to have a conversation, a real conversation with the creator of the universe. That's amazing that we have that ability. Focus your attention away from you when you do it for other people to others and God and his work. Because look for God working in this broken world, because he is. You should always have a mindset to think, is this God? Because he's working all the, I really believe he's providentially working all the time. Now, it's different than moving chess pieces, but he's working all the time. I usually explain providence is we're walking down a trail, and on one trail is this big bear, on Trail A, and Trail A is like unicorns and rainbows, and so like what do we do as humans? We walk to the bear, and then the bear mauls us, and we're like, God, why did you do that? But in reality, God said, look, I gave you this path of unicorn, not unicorn, but rainbows and like all of that. That's provident, and God's constantly doing that in this world. Look for that. What greater joy to know that God is doing that in your life, in his sovereign world all the time. So remember, joy is a contentment that we're doing what God has called us to do, and content that he will work his sovereign will. Let's say that one more time. This is what Randy and I texted to each other this week. Contentment that we are doing what God has called us to do, and content that he will work his sovereign will. That is joy. It does not mean that I can't be sorrowful in that. But joy is the contentment to know that God is working and that I am a part of his plan. How cool is that? Father, we thank you that you are a great God. We thank you that you are at work in this world. And Lord, even though as we get older and we struggle with things of this world and the humanity, we also know that there is a world coming that's far greater than this, that will make this look like pittance in comparison to what it's going to be. Lord, I pray that we will live well now, but also live well with the anticipation of what life will be with you. We thank everything in your blessed name. Amen.